dominance was up here, I said over and over again that it would likely drop down here to the lows. Now the question is, what we're seeing right now, is this move by ETH dominance the same thing as what we saw in September of 2019, or is it something different? Well, if it is like September of 2019, you should note that it did actually come back down a few months later and double bottom. But technically, the bottom was in, right? Technically, it was in when it did get that bounce. Obviously, I've been pretty vocal about altcoins bleeding. I still think they will. But I also have said that there does exist a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs go to a lower low on potentially a future ETH Bitcoin higher low or double bottom, right? I actually think that if ETH dominance were to double bottom, let's say it does this, where, you know, it's up in this range right here for a few weeks, and then if it like comes back down in say like August, July, August, September, and then goes up, right? If it did something like that, which is basically what it did last cycle, I would guess that Bitcoin dominance would actually be higher here than it is here, even if ETH dominance is higher, even if it's a higher low. And the reason for that is because I think a lot of alt Bitcoin pairs will make that same move, right? You see how ETH dominance return to the range lows? I think the argument is that alt Bitcoin pairs will return to the range lows. So ETH already made this move down here, but alts have not. Alts have not. And note that last cycle, the move to the range lows by altcoins actually occurred in the summer, and that's what we are about to approach. Now, obviously, in recent days, we've seen alt Bitcoin pairs go up a little bit. This often happens when you sweep a prior low, which is why I said in the Bitcoin dominance video that I released, right? It's why I said that, you know, it's kind of risky putting out Bitcoin dominance videos near FOMC meetings, because a lot of times you'll get a little bit of a rally after that. I can't know for sure exactly how high all Bitcoin pairs will go, but I do think they likely will break down. It's possible they could rally all the way back up to the bull market support band before breaking down, but I do think the likely outcome this summer is that all Bitcoin pairs will in fact go lower. That is my base case. And you know, there is something to be said about the strength of the ETH Bitcoin rally and kind of the lackluster strength of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. Kind of making it seem like what I'm suggesting could happen, where, you know, maybe ETH Bitcoin double bottoms or puts in a higher low on a future lower low by alt Bitcoin pairs. Now, you might not buy that, but one thing you should look at, instead of looking at alt Bitcoin pairs, look at alt ETH pairs. You see this? If altcoins are oscillators against Bitcoin, what if they're also oscillators against Ethereum? You can see that last cycle, altcoins topped out around this valuation against Ethereum. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're just going to just go straight down. The more likely outcome is that they bounce around up in this range for a little while before going back down. But what I am suggesting is that there's a good chance that altcoins don't go too much higher on their ETH pairs, even though there likely will be a bounce at some point, right? And in fact, last cycle, there was a bounce by alt ETH pairs around this level, right? I mean, I don't know why I drew it like that, but if you just draw a line across, right, from this level right here, at least the weekly close, it's basically where alt ETH pairs just hit. So keep that in mind, that, you know, alts could bounce around here against Ethereum for a little while, but I ultimately do think that they will likely go back down, right, where alts start to underperform Ethereum. So the reason for that, again, is because they hit the range highs, and I'm operating under the assumption for now that it's an oscillator, right? Altcoins are oscillating against Ethereum, right? That's sort of the assumption I'm working under. And so I think that the most likely outcome is that it forms some type of distribution phase up here, and then alts bleed against Ethereum. Now, here's where it gets tricky, right? And I mean, I obviously I can't make a video without talking about it, right? Here's where it gets tricky, and it's the USD valuation of Ethereum. And I know that's what everyone wants to know about. And it's hard because for me, I felt like this was a fair value, right? I did. And I told, you know, ITC members, and I'm pretty sure I told you guys too on the public channel, that that was a fair accumulation zone. We did a whole video on it, right, where we said, welcome home, Ethereum, right? The fair value, the quote-unquote fair value of Ethereum had finally arrived. And in that video, Ethereum was actually at 1,600. And if you guys remember, my base case was that Ethereum would bleed to the $1,200 to $1,500 range, right? That was kind of the base case, you know, as we saw Ethereum bleed down. And one of the reasons for that, let me switch over to an exchange that the wicks aren't quite as brutal, right? If you look at this exchange here, one of the things we were talking about is this, right? This trend line here, where you basically tag the trend line, your first tag, your second tag, it kind of tagged it a couple times, right? And then your third tag at the fair value. Now, we talked about this a lot because that was the pattern that the S&P 500 did back in 1990. Remember when we talked about that so many times? You know, what was the S&P 500 doing back in 1989 to 1990? And so many people gave me hell for it, right? So many people gave me hell for this idea that Ethereum would tag a, you know, sort of the lower low again, right? Again. And it happened, right? And again, it had this move, it did bounce, and then it did go a little bit lower in the recession. So, obviously, everyone's going to want to know, you know, is it possible for Ethereum to go to the lower regression band, like the lower part of the regression band? I would say this. Anything's possible, right? Anything's possible. I don't think it makes sense to, you know, to like bet everything on that idea, which is why I thought it made sense to accumulate back when it was home in case it doesn't come back down. But I want to explore, you know, what happens if it does? Like, what would we expect in that environment? One of the videos that I put out that I would encourage people to watch is called The Butterfly Effect, right? And the butterfly effect is basically, you know, it's kind of what the S&P 500 did, right? Where you try to break this level, you know, you go up, you try to break it, you fail. And then you go up again, you try to break it, and you fail. And then you go up again, and you fail. And every time you go a little bit lower to get more buyers, right? You just keep going a little bit lower, and you get more buyers, and a little bit lower, and you keep trying again. And then eventually you try, and then it breaks through, right? So the butterfly effect, though, for Ethereum states that essentially this pattern, right? A, or the X to the A to B to C to D, right? Somewhere up there. And C can go, it doesn't have to go as low as this, but C can go as low as like a 0.886 or something like that. Maybe even a little bit lower, but something like that. The 0.886. It can go as low as that, but it doesn't have to, right? And so when I was watching Ethereum throughout this entire phase, I'm like, yeah, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna try at a lot of these different locations, but eventually it's going to make its way down here, and then it's going to try to then break out its new all-time highs after it comes home. Now the question that I'm sort of wrestling